The Sherman Firefly was a medium tank used by the United Kingdom and some armored formations of other allies in the Second World War. It was based on the US M4 Sherman, but was fitted with the more powerful British 76.2 mm 3 rewrote caliber 17-pounder anti-tank gun as its primary weapon. Conceived as a stopgap until future British tank designs came into service, the Sherman Firefly became the most common vehicle mounting the 17-pounder in the war. The British Army made extensive use of Sherman tanks, but they expected to have their own tank models developed soon, so the idea of mounting the 17-pounder in the Sherman was initially rejected. However, through the efforts of two persistent British officers, government reluctance was eventually overcome, and the Firefly went into production. This proved fortunate, as the cruiser Mk8 Challenger and cruiser Mk8 Cromwell tank designs experienced difficulties and delays. After the problem of getting such a large gun to fit in the Sherman's turret was solved, the Firefly was put into production in early 1944, in time to equip the 21st Army Group, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, for the Normandy landings. It soon became highly valued, as its gun could almost always penetrate the armor of the Panther and Tiger tanks it faced in Normandy, something no other British or American tank could reliably do. Because the Firefly's barrel was visibly longer than that of a normal 75 mm Sherman, crews tried to countershade camouflage it so the tank would look like a regular Sherman from a distance. Between 2100 and 2200 were manufactured before production ended in 1945. It is unknown if this includes 100 tanks built for the United States. The idea of fitting a 17-pounder gun into a Sherman tank was rejected by the Ministry of Supply's Tank Decision Board. Although the British Army had made extensive use of the American-built Sherman, it was intended that a new generation of British tanks would replace it. First, there was the Cromwell, which was expected to use the Vickers high-velocity 75 mm gun. This gun would have had superior anti-tank performance to the US 75 mm and 76 mm guns that were mounted in the Sherman. The second was the A-30 Challenger, which was based on the Cromwell but with the even more powerful 17-pounder gun. These two tanks and their successors, the Comet and the Centurion, which were already on the drawing board, were to replace the Sherman in British service, and the prospect of diverting resources to mount the 17-pounder on the Sherman seemed undesirable. Major George Brighty of the Royal Tank Regiment was at the Lulworth Armored Fighting School in early 1943. Despite the A-30 Challenger undergoing initial trials at Lulworth, Brighty was convinced that the Sherman was a better mount for the 17-pounder. The turret of the Sherman was too small to allow for the very long recoil of the gun. In a radical adjustment, Brighty removed the recoil system and locked the gun in place, thus making the entire tank absorb the recoil. But this was far from an ideal situation, and there was no telling how long the tank would have been able to handle such a setup. Around June 1943, a colleague of Brighty, Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge of the Royal Tank Regiment, arrived at Lulworth. A veteran of the North Africa campaign, Witheridge had experienced firsthand the one-sided battles between British tanks armed with the 40mm 2-pounder gun and Rommel's formidable tanks and anti-tank guns. During the Battle of Gazala in mid-1942, Witheridge had been blown out of his M3 Grant medium tank, and though he recovered from his wounds, he was declared unfit to return to combat duty. In January 1943, he was posted to Fort Knox in the United States for 6 months to advise on gunnery, where he was sold on the Sherman. While at Lulworth, Witheridge inspected the A-30 Challenger and joined in the chorus of complaints about the tank. Upon looking up Brighty and learning of his attempts to improve the Sherman, Witheridge lent his assistance. He advised Brighty on methods to solve the recoil problem. Not long after, Witheridge and Brighty received a notice from the Department of Tank Design, DTD, to cease their efforts. Unwilling to abandon the project, Witheridge, using his connections with such influential people as Major General Raymond Briggs, former General Officer Commanding the 1st Armored Division in North Africa and then Director of the Royal Armored Corps, successfully lobbied Claude Gibb, Director General of Weapons and Instruments Production at the Ministry of Supply, to make it an official ministry project. Gibb was able to explain to the detractors that not only was it possible, but it should be doable in England. He had liaised with Colonel William Watson, who in late 1942 had returned from secondment to Australia to work on the production of the Australian AC-1 Sentinel tank, onto which the 17-pounder had been mounted. With this development, the endeavor was taken out of the hands of the highly enthusiastic and devoted amateurs at Lulworth, who had initiated it, and given to professional tank developers. U.G.K. Kilbourne, a Vickers engineer working for the DTD, transformed their idea into the reality of the prototype of the tank that would serve the British forces from the invasion of Normandy in June 1944. The first thing he had to fix was the lack of a workable recoil system for the 17-pounder. The 17-pounder traveled 40 and 1.0 UM back as it absorbed the recoil of the blast. This was too long for the Sherman's turret. Kilbourne solved this problem by redesigning the recoil system completely rather than modifying it. The recoil cylinders were shortened and placed on both sides of the gun to take advantage of the width of the turret. The gun breech itself was also rotated 90 degrees to allow loading from the left rather than from on top. Note 1. The radio, normally mounted in the back of the turret in British tanks, had to be moved. An armored box, a bustle, was attached to the back of the turret to house it, with access through a large hole cut through the turret. The next problem encountered by Kilbourne was that the gun cradle, the metal block on which the gun sat, had to be shortened to allow the gun to fit into the Firefly, and thus the gun itself was not very stable. Kilbourne had a new barrel designed for the 17-pounder that had a longer, untapered section at the base, which helped solve the stability problem. A new mantlet was designed to house this gun and the modified cradle. The Firefly had no armor or mobility advantages over the normal Sherman tank beyond the additional 13 mm of protection added to its mantlet. The modifications were extensive enough that 17-pounders intended for the Firefly had to be factory-built specifically for it. Kilbourne had to deal with additional complications. On the standard Sherman tank, there was a single hatch in the turret through which the commander, gunner, and loader entered and exited the tank. The 17-pounder's larger breech and recoil system made it significantly more difficult for the loader to exit quickly. A new hatch was cut into the top of the turret over the gunner's position to resolve this. The final major change was the elimination of the hull gunner in favor of space for more 17-pounder ammunition, which was longer than the original 75 mm. By October and November 1943, enthusiasm began to grow for the project. The 21st Army Group was informed of the new tank in October. Even before final testing had taken place in February 1944, an order for 2,100 Sherman tanks armed with the 17-pounder gun was placed, as the Challenger program was suffering constant delays, and it was realized that few would be ready for Normandy. Even worse, it was discovered that the Cromwell did not have a turret ring wide enough to take the new high velocity 75 mm gun, 50 calibers long, so it would have to be armed with the general purpose Ordnance QF 75 mm. This left the Firefly as the only tank available with firepower superior to the QF 75 mm gun in the British arsenal, earning it the highest priority from Winston Churchill. Firefly in period sources often refers to any vehicle with a 17-pounder gun, often the 17 PDR SP Achilles M10C variant of the M10 tank destroyer. The main armament of the Sherman Firefly was the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder. Designed as the successor to the British QF 6-pounder, the 17-pounder was the most powerful British tank gun of the war, and one of the most powerful of any nationality, being able to penetrate more armor than the 8.8 cm KWK-36 fitted to the German Tiger P. The 17-pounder was theoretically able to penetrate some 163 mm, 6.4 in, of armor at 500 mm, 550 YD, and 150 mm, 5.9 in, at 1,000 onmafirm, 1/112, using standard armor-piercing, capped, ballistic-capped, APCBC ammunition. Armor-piercing, discarding Sabot, APDS, ammunition could penetrate some 250 cm of armor at 500 mm and 233 mm at 1,000 mm, which on paper could defeat the armor of almost every German armored fighting vehicle at any likely range. However, war production APDS rounds lacked accuracy, and the 50 mm penetrator was less destructive after it had penetrated enemy tank armor than the 76.2 mm APCBC shell. APDS ammunition was rare until the post-war period. While the Sherman Firefly was capable of carrying 77 rounds of ammunition, the tank's design features meant that only 23 rounds were easily and readily available when the tank was in action. Though the 17-pounder had superior anti-tank capabilities, it lacked an effective HE round, and was thus inferior to the standard Sherman 75 mm gun against soft targets, such as infantry, buildings, and lightly armored vehicles. As the war in Europe neared its close, the Allies found themselves encountering these more often than heavy German tanks. Allied tank units, therefore, typically refused to completely switch to Fireflies. A good HE shell for the gun only became available in late 1944, and even then was not as potent as the standard Sherman 75mm HE shell. Another problem was that the powerful blast from the 17-pounder gun kicked up large amounts of dirt as well as smoke, making it difficult for the gunner to observe the fall of the shot, and forcing him to rely on the commander to observe it and to order corrections, and revealing the position of the tank, forcing the Firefly to move every few shots. The recoil and muzzle blast could be severely jarring to Firefly crews, and the muzzle blast frequently caused night blindness. The latter was a problem common to any tank armed with a high-velocity gun, including the Panther and Tiger I. The cramped turret meant that loading the large shell was difficult, so the Firefly had a slower rate of fire than a standard M4 Sherman. Since the Firefly was a stopgap, these problems were never eliminated, as it was supposed to be retired with the introduction of the new British tank designs such as the Comet and later Centurion. The Firefly's secondary armament was the standard 0.3-inch, 7.62mm Browning M1919 machine gun coaxial in the turret, the hull-mounted machine gun being removed to increase ammunition storage for the main gun. A 50-inch, 12.77mm Nemesis M2. Browning heavy machine gun was also fitted on the turret roof, though many crews removed it due to its awkward mounting and position near the commander, which limited a full 360-degree view when the hatch was open. In 1945, some British Fireflies were fitted with a rail on either side of the turret for two RP-3 60mm high-explosive 3-inch rockets. Called Sherman Tulips, these were used at the Rhine crossing by the 1st Battalion, Coldstream Guards. The rockets, accurate when fired from aircraft, were less accurate when fired from a stationary platform, such as a tank, as they had little initial slipstream over the fins. The RP-3 was only effective when its 60-pound warhead hit the target. 3 different variants of Sherman Firefly served during the Second World War, each based on a different variant of the M4 Sherman. The Firefly conversion was carried out on Sherman Kemp's M4, Sherman Thor Hybrid, M4 Composite, Sherman Thor 4, M4A3, 65-68 built for the United States, and Sherman 5, M4A4 tanks. Some sources state that several Sherman T2s, M4A1, were converted and used in action, but photos allegedly showing these conversions are, in fact, views of the front. Half of Sherman the hybrid Fireflies. To complicate matters, a very small number of Canadian license-built Sherman 2s, M4A1, the Grizzly, were converted to Fireflies in Canada and used for training, but none saw action. The majority of Shermans converted were the Sherman VM4A4 model, of which the British received about 7,200. The Sherman VC and IC variants are easily distinguished by their lower hulls. The VC has a lengthened hull and larger gaps between the suspension units. They employed the 3-piece bolted transmission housing. The Sherman IC usually had a cast transmission housing. The hybrid can be distinguished by its upper hull, which is cast and gives it a distinctive curved look in comparison to the more boxy hull of a typical Sherman. Production of the Firefly started in January 1944, and, by 31st May, some 342 Sherman Fireflies had been delivered to the 21st Army Group for the D-Day landings. British tank troops were composed of 3 units equipped with standard Shermans and 1 with Fireflies. The same distribution occurred in Cromwell units, but this caused logistical problems, as each Cromwell troop then needed to be supplied with parts for 2 different tanks. The Firefly was also slower than the Cromwell. Churchill units received no Fireflies, and as a result, often had to rely on any attached M10 or M10 Achilles units to provide increased firepower to deal with tanks their own guns could not handle. United Kingdom, Northwest Europe, 4th Armored Brigade, 8th Armored Brigade, P7th Armored Brigade, 3rd Armored Brigade, Guards Armored Division, 7th Armored Division, 7th Armored Division, Italy, 1st Armored Division, 6th Armored Division. The 7th Armored Brigade and 9th Armored Brigade do not appear to have used Fireflies. Canada 1st Canadian Armored Brigade received 2 Fireflies per troop when it moved to the Netherlands from Italy in 1945. The 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, 4th Canadian Armored Division, 5th Canadian Armoured Division used Firefly tanks in Northwest Europe in 1945. New Zealand. The 4th New Zealand Armoured Brigade operated Firefly tanks in Italy in 1944 and 1945. Poland. Both the Polish 1st Armoured Division in Northwestern Europe and the Polish 2nd Armoured Brigade in Italy operated Firefly tanks. Czechoslovakia. 1st Czechoslovak Independent Armoured Brigade, South Africa. The 6th South African Armoured Division operated Firefly tanks in Italy in 1944 and 1945. United States. The United States received 80 specially made Fireflies. They were uniquely operated 5658 M4A3 based. Argentina. The Argentine Army purchased over 200 in 1947, in service until the mid-1970s. Belgium. Italy. Lebanon. The Lebanese Army received 16 Firefly tanks sold by Italy as scrap in 1949, in service until the mid-1970s. 2 of them were passed on to the Al-Murabitun militia and 14 to the Lebanese Arab Army in 1976. Netherlands. Paraguay received 3, donated by Argentina in 1971.